Hi everyone, welcome to my lecture for this year's Fast Forward 2026. Just a really quick introduction. Hi, I'm Ramya Espiritu. I am one of the three CAP members for Fast Forward this year. A little bit about me, I am a member of the UP Debate Society and I'm an incoming freshman major in sociology. Um, yeah, so let's start the lecture proper. Just a couple of this is a preamble before I move on. Just a couple of caveats. The first is that the structure of this lecture is not really going to be like a lecture. Um, it's really more just like a podcast. So feel free to listen to me in the background. And I really wanted to be a bit more conversational and more me breaking down these motions together with you, and kind of sharing my 2 cents, some things that I know outside of like a debate context, and that might maybe give you a more nuanced perspective on how to illustrate in these motions or what arguments you can generate in these motions. So I don't have a PhD in gender studies, so I'm not really giving you like the most extensive lecture on like gender history or um, anything. But so that's why like the structure of this is like not really structured like a lecture. Um, so take note of that. The second is again, as I mentioned, I'm not an expert, and I definitely do have biases, which will reveal themselves later on when I talk about the motions. So I want to note that because I'm going to reference some journal articles, some books, and me choosing these books were done out of these biases that I myself hold. So I'm trying to be fair as much as possible when I discuss these things, and I hope that they can be helpful regardless. But you can definitely not agree with how I view these motions or what I think is the right case. That's fine. But maybe my perspective can give you an idea of what you can run or maybe get like the ball rolling on like how to think of these motions. The third is that if you're looking at this lecture because you want to get better at feminism debates, um, the biggest advice that I can really give is just you want like before I go on to the more content stuff is the way that you want to approach feminism debates is like just make sure that you aren't homogenizing the feminist movement. I think many people, including myself, have this tendency to mostly argue as if the feminist movement is made up of women in general. It's just a general group of women, and we're just talking about what they have to believe, what is good for them and what isn't. And oftentimes that gets really hard and it makes clashes really difficult to deal with because, again, obviously women are very diverse. They come from different contexts. So when we approach these motions or when you go into any feminism round, there's definitely more work that needs to be done when it comes to researching specific contexts and also integrating our knowledge of these specific contexts and the diversity of women's experiences in argumentation. I'm going to review one of my biases now, which is that I believe that like the choice feminism case is low genuinely kind of lazy, and so I don't really like that. And I think one of the ways that feminism debates can stop feeling so repetitive and can start feeling a bit more interesting is if we veer away from like universalizing, um, like not doing the hard work of explaining how our different interests can converge with each other and how we can sort of unite them. Because choice feminism is just like everything goes, just practice feminism how you want to, which I don't think is doing the work of movement making. But anyway, the last bit of preamble is this lecture is fairly condensed. So again, it's really important to know specific context and to integrate that. But I can't really go into the history of feminism in every region. Um, I'll just give some examples that I do know or that I'm somewhat knowledgeable about. And then at the end of this, I'll just give like a mini syllabus of um like other things that you can look into if you're interested in deepening your knowledge on the movement or on feminist ideology. Because I think there's definitely other specializations that you can and should explore because they're really interesting beyond just like the debate benefit. They're also um, hot topics in terms of female liberation and gender issues. Yeah, so that's the bit of the preamble. let's get on to the lecture proper. So, the first motion that we're going to look at is this House believes that feminist groups should refrain from claiming that women who oppose feminism are operating under false consciousness. So, this motion is of particular interest to me for a couple of reasons. The first is because one of the most controversial feminist writers whom I actually like really enjoy reading, admittedly, wrote a book about this, and her name is Andrea Dworkin, and the book is called Right Wing Women. And I'll talk about that more extensively in a bit. But the second reason why I like it is because there's a motion that is pretty similar to this in a PSDC like some time back. It was in 2023, I believe. And it was a question of whether or not the feminist movement should denounce pick me girls. So that motion's a bit old, but I think that motion and this one are really interesting because like the question is like an implicit concern about movement building. It's a question about what narrative we should create about people who are in like who are part of our cause, um, but also actively try to harm the women in our movement or actively try to oppose this cause. And it's a question of if we think they are deserving of acceptance in this movement, if they have a place in it, and if they do have a place in it, how do we integrate them inside it? So I think those are really important questions on like strategies of movement building, and you will see other iterations of the same question in a different context. Like for example, I think there used to be a motion that was popular about um like the elections, like how do we paint the masses who voted for BBM, for example, like how does the Philippine opposition do that? So there like it's a bit similar because it's really a question about um movement building. So at this point, I'm gonna talk a bit about um, Dworkin's work because her analysis explains the possible logic and the thought process for why women would opt out of the movement or why they would harbor anti-feminist stances. So to preface, Dworkin is like a staunchly radical feminist of the second wave. And she says like pretty controversial things about like sex work and pornography, and she receives a lot of criticism about that. Some criticism I agree with, and some I really don't. But anyway, I wanted to discuss her work about right wing women because basically she analyzes how even if our current view of them, and the like more intuitive thing to do, the more intuitive narrative to paint about them is that they're brainwashed and they're evil and um, they've fully submitted their entire consciousness to the evil patriarchy. Um, she says that they actually have a very clear view of what the world does to women. They understand that, for example, systemically, men view them as sexual objects, or that in places like the workplace or in the market economy, women are very vulnerable to living in poverty and to being exploited um, sexually and just in work, right? So it is this very understanding that they have of these conditions that often push them to embrace conservatism, because the promise of the right is that if these women like dress up, smile, or pray as men want, then they are going to instead achieve and attain stability. They're going to attain protection from a life that is otherwise plagued by rejection, by ridicule, by isolation, and by abuse, which they see a lot of the women who are subversive and who go to the left experience. So what these women do is that they attempt to increase their values through proving conformity and by comparing themselves to other women that they degrade as lesser than. They often do things like trade off their ambitions and creative pursuits and instead bear and rear children because this is the only social contribution that is really truly credited to women. So really, she points to their actions and their beliefs as a matter of survival, and not just them being brainwashed. Like they actually have, like they can't control their conditions, but they've acted as agents who, coped with those conditions in this specific way. So interestingly, there's also a discussion about how knowing the true fears and desires that govern the decisions of these women is often used as a tactic by the right. So the right often banks on their genuine and real fear of assault and violence, and instead they use this and turn it towards easier and more acceptable targets. For example, this looks like the way that like they're likely to adopt transphobic and lessophobic views, because it's really easy to think that it is trans people and it's lesbians who want to objectify them, who want to abuse them, and who want to sexually take advantage of them. And it's much easier to ostracize these, already casted aside groups of people, as opposed to questioning and fighting against the violence of men whom they believe offers them protection. She also says that right wing women actually view the world pretty, pretty similarly to like radical feminists like herself, in that they believe that patriarchal hierarchy cannot be reformed, except a lot of these women instead accept their position in it to be protected from the comparative danger that comes to women who subvert and revolt. Whereas a lot of radical feminists instead do the opposite, where they believe that if reformation cannot happen, then the only option is destruction. I think this is worth mentioning because this proves that um, there is a possibility of reconciliation, because there is a shared worldview or shared understanding of the world. And therefore, they don't really have false consciousness of their position in society or of their experiences as women, or or their experiences as women, but it's instead about um, what they think it means to survive, or what it takes to survive, what they're willing to trade off and bargain, which are things that the movement can, you know, reframe, the things that the movement can negotiate with these other women. I think there's also a really good discussion as well about how a lot of these women aren't actually settling for like traditional conservative men, but it is that they actively think of them as better alternatives as opposed to men in the left with whom they harbor very deep mistrust. So, because they believe that a lot of leftist men often instead adopt like a sexual culture of promiscuity, um, they don't actually trust that it is liberation, as they say, but they believe that this is really only weaponized by leftist men in order to make more women even more vulnerable to the sexual aggression of even more men. And so they believe that, for example, submitting to or like buying into the institution of marriage means that they're opting for the lesser evil, because the alternative is that they still have to sell their bodies to multiple men, as opposed to marriage is a private agreement with just one. Um, and of course, right now in our contemporary discourse, a lot of anti-feminist women and many figures of the right, like these manosphere podcasters, are also adopting like their own narratives of like sex slavery into their propaganda of female duty. So right, like as opposed to just like these right wing women or these anti feminist women, as well as these right wing men, are no longer just espousing like the institution, like monogamy, you should only have one partner. In fact, a lot of them are doing the thing that like the right wing women that Andrea Dworkin talks about, the thing that they're afraid of, which is the co-optation of sexual liberation, using it for further female exploitation and oppression. um and what's funny is that, yes, the critique, or like the like given the analysis of Dworkin, it is a very valid critique of leftist men that they often like many of them are very much misogynistic, and many of them definitely are complicit in the sexual exploitation and oppression of women. But it's also a lie that this isn't what right wing men want either, even during that time, or even um, with like the right wing, even during the period that Andrea Dworkin wrote about. Like this has always been the case, even with men of God who are like, OF account detected, opinion rejected. Like these are also the same people who have purchased from these OF girls, who have kept the sale of sex to be in demand even during that time. And so what I think this means is that this proves Dworkin's argument that aligning our backs with men of power or political authority doesn't really protect us from their violence any more than subversive or quote unquote promiscuous women. And really, these right wing women are building their lives on a pipe dream that there is a performance of respectability of moral righteousness that shields them and that shields any of us really from patriarchal violence so long as we can carve out this narrative of a worse, more evil, um, more cunning woman and scapegoat them as more deserving of violence than us. And I think that this is a really interesting point that comes out from the book. One, because I think it's pretty incisive of anti-feminist women, while also being quite like understanding. I don't think the tone is demonizing them at all. Neither do I think it takes on a very pitying, we need to save them tone. I think it's an analysis that can be cross-applied to any side in this debate. But that last bit of analysis about how we believe in this pipe dream that there is like a level of respectability that we can all reach and perform, that if we attain that means that we are safe from the possibility of being, oppressed, of being sexually exploited, of receiving backlash and violence from the patriarchy and from men. I think that's something that not just right wing women do, but that even a lot of people who view themselves as feminists have done. And this is where I kind of segue to a mini discussion on the PSDC motion that I thought this was quite reminiscent of. So the PSDC motion was this house believes that this house as the feminist movement or believes that the feminist movement should denounce pick me girls. And I thought this was quite interesting. And I actually really like this on government because I think that with the Dworkin analysis in mind, a lot of pick me girls actually do this out of survivability, but two is because it's really hard to not be a pick me girl with the way that we are conditioned to center so much of our lives, so much of like our self worth on male validation and male attention. And for the feminist movement to denounce these girls is odd because I think so many women become pick me girls or are pick me girls at some point in their lives. I'm pretty sure I've done things that count me as a pick me girl, or I've done pick me girl things before, even if I don't intend to, or even if my morals say otherwise. Um, a lot of women often do imperfect and bad things, especially with the conditions that they are in. And to denounce women who, need to do these things or feel the need to do these things, who react to their oppression in this way, is, I don't think that's a movement that is building itself up to actually deal with the complications of um victimhood. It's a movement that isn't really contending with the contradictions of many women who are still very much deserving of, being part of a movement on liberation, while also, carrying that contradiction about like how they act and how they, you know, are forced to be a certain way by these larger structures. Um, but obviously, there's the more complicated question of, do these women do good, like, does the move cannot the movement afford to make place for these women? In what way can we make place for them? Can we create a place for them in a way that doesn't destroy our movement, or that doesn't tolerate the bad actions that they do to women, or the very terrible ideas that they espouse about women? So that, I think, is where the clash lies, and what complicates that motion a little bit. And so I'll move on to the actual debate stuff. Really smooth segue to the actual motion at hand. Before I talk about it, I want to do a really quick shout out to Matcha Kuwal, because I consulted her about this part to clarify like my own thoughts. Like, my debate brain was being really foggy. Um, Given that, like, and that's true for most feminism motions. Like, I have real world um experience that I have a really hard time translating into debate ideas. So she helped me with that, and she also provided me with like really good insight on the motion. So yeah, shout out to Matcha. So the first thing to flag about this motion is, I think that obviously it is less about whether anti-feminist women actually operate on false consciousness, and it's not really a debate about, sorry, it's not really a debate about if false consciousness exists at all, because it's a pretty contested idea in the academe with both feminists and also Marxists. Um, so it's really a messaging debate. It's a debate on the strategy of the movement. So obviously, the narrative that these groups create on government side is this idea that the women who reject feminism do so often because they have real and genuine fears about what it means to survive in a system that, will not make a woman truly her own anyway. That, even in leftist movements, they often have to yield to male leaders. That even like whether or not they choose to be conservative or to be sexually liberated, it becomes really hard to truly claim their body as their own. And therefore, because of this great disillusionment that they face, oftentimes they make these decisions out of survival. Compared to opposition, who instead will proliferate a narrative of these women as victims who are brainwashed and often indoctrinated before they have yet to realize what it is they truly want, or um, like, yeah, what it is they truly want, or to make an actual choice that is theirs. So I think the difference in these narratives is that the government narrative lends a bit more agency to these women. Um, so it's that thing where it's like, yes, they can't control their conditions, but they're agentic enough to make this decision to survive, and therefore that means that, like they don't operate under false consciousness. They're fully aware of like their position in the social and gender system. They do these things because they need to protect themselves, which they have the right to do, etc. And opposition, for example, is more about like breaking it down. So because government acknowledges the level of agency that these women have, then the strategy could look like, instead appealing to their worldview, and changing like our messaging to fit that worldview, and to be instead like, oh, actually feminism is the solution to get what you realize you want. Whereas opposition is more about breaking that worldview down. And then the end question of this clash is about how these women are likely to respond. So, if that was confusing, which my bad, a really good analogy or a similar motion that I think is also interesting to think about is that motion about what the feminist movement should do with men. Like, should we tailor our feminist messaging to be like, men actually benefit from feminism too? Or should we be more corrective and iron fist about their behaviors? So the first one again is a lot more sympathetic, will probably talk about how, will appeal to the ways that they feel, you know, oppressed by like patriarchal competition or whatever. Whereas the second one is less concerned about the reasons for why they do bad things, and is more about shaming and correcting them into not doing these bad things. That's a really interesting debate, and I actually think it's quite 50-50. But yeah, the end question of both that clash and the clash that we just talked about is how is this group of people that we're interacting with likely to respond to our messaging? But if in this specific motion, it's a bit harder for opposition to prove why breaking it down would mean that they would want to integrate into the movement, which fair enough. Because if I were Gov, I would just explain that like you further alienate these women, and that is bad because that means you cut out their support systems. And again, because the patriarchy doesn't pick and choose who, they believe is deserving of violence and assault, if and when these women do experience that, they'll just not be able to turn to um, the movement. The movement won't be accepting of them because of their previous um, complicated and bad behavior. So I think that's an interesting and pretty strong angle government can take. But alternatively, what OP could run is they could shift the goal to be not about trying to let feminist messaging reach these people, because these people will likely not change anyway. They don't trust you, etc. It's gonna be more, instead, the goal of the movement is about the women who are already in it and what they believe in and how we are able to keep our movement intact. So the idea is that if government side gets reintegration as they want, you argue that that's even worse for the movement, because what it does is that it increases the tolerance of individuals, um, of like the harm that can be done onto women or that can be said about the movement, because you're willing to accept these people, or before they even reintegrate, you are tailor fitting messaging that is more sympathetic towards them. And so that means that the movement is far less corrective about what is actually feminist and aligned, or what is actually in the interest of women, because they entertain actions of anti feminist women as logical, as valid choices for survivability, etc. And the problem with that is that it allows the movement or this messaging to eventually devolve into something like choice feminism, where even the most harmful behaviors to others and as well as oneself becomes branded as valid or feminist choices, even when it actually impedes on like other people's agency, for example, or other women's agency. And therefore it becomes much harder to correct what behaviors we think are feminist aligned, and the movement becomes far more fractured, etc. So let's go on to the second motion. The second motion is something I debated in 2024. So it's this house believes that feminists should heavily advocate for antinatalism. The reason I chose this is because it's a pretty, I would say it has the format of, oh sorry, it has the format of very popular um, and kind of reused feminism motions, which is like, should feminists should the feminist movement heavily advocate for this thing that intuitively we think is bad for women? So, for example, it's like, should they um, like stop them, like actively discourage women from getting married or something like that? Stuff on antinatal, obviously like antinatalism, motherhood, um also like sex work usually. So though that kind of format, usually they follow similar clashes. Like one side is gonna run like choice feminism, and like these things aren't inherently bad, many women actually experience them in good and empowering ways. And then the other side is gonna be like, no, it is systemically a bad thing, etc. So that's why I think that this is a pretty interesting motion to dissect, because I think the general idea, um, the of this can be cross applied to like other similar motions of the same flavor. Um, but I specifically for this motion, I specifically want to talk about the government responses because I think like um the choice feminism case is pretty solid uh like when it is ran and in like debate logic, it's very easy to buy, and there are very many reasons that have been ran by many different people and reran by other people. And so the choice feminism case has like a pretty good success rate, at least from what I've seen and experienced. Maybe it's actually different, and this is all a lie created by me. But yeah, the choice feminism case I think is pretty solid, and there are many examples that you can turn to of like a well ran choice feminism case. But instead I want to pick it apart a little bit to understand like what are the holes in it. And then after that I'm gonna talk a little bit about specific illustrations for this motion because I think the importance of feminism motions and the way to not make them repetitive and boring, as I've heard many people complain about like feminism motions, is to make the illustration precise and nuanced. And so I'll talk about that after this. So on this motion, OP is definitely probably going to run a choice feminism case. Maybe they'll push that this advocacy is very coercive and it will alienate women who do want to become mothers. And therefore, it is better in the alternative where you don't advocate for antinatalism because if you do, you are making a very explicit stance against this choice that they've made. You make them feel anti-feminist and make it seem like the choices that they make or their source of empowerment is like misaligned with the feminist movement and their goals. They might also run a more honest form of this case, which is like they'll concede to the fact that there are many states that largely are coercive about motherhood to say that, well, women can't stop having children, they'll have children and opt into motherhood regardless. At least if the movement is not able to change their material conditions, they can provide solace. I hate that word, but they'll probably say that. So, what are my problems with this op argument? The first is just that I think that it implicitly downplays how change is achieved by movements. Um, because like this whole thing of like at least if the movement can't materially change their conditions or stop them from opting into motherhood, then the only change that you can achieve is to provide them solace, and the only way that you can do that is by validating this choice. I don't think that's true because like the burden for this advocacy for antinatalism doesn't mean like we want to overthrow the patriarchy in 3 days. Like it can also be done through the same messaging strategies that like opposition will have to develop. And the capacity and will also probably rely on the same capacity of the movement, right? But also I think it undermines the like what this messaging can do. Like it actually does have a significant impact. Like it can cause a big worry, a significant worry on a macro level. Like many states, especially in like states with declining birth rates, aging economies, they are so worried about the women not wanting to procreate. Like they are very honest about it. Like states are very honest about it. They also create it has also pushed them to create welfare programs that like actively incentivize or encourage these women to give birth. So there's that. But it's also that there's just important work that is being done by simply creating class consciousness, which is mostly the goal of like anti-natalist feminists, which in itself is very important for movements. And that's why they have, for example, things like a propaganda wing, right? Like they want to create class consciousness about like for example certain struggles that are made inherent and tethered to motherhood. And so what you can explain is that this um this advocacy is not really about like demonizing mothers or hating mothers. Really, it is just about highlighting the struggles that are made inherent to motherhood. And a specific illustration of this might help, specific to like antinatalism. So in like contemporary society right now, this is most seen in China and South Korea, where antinatalist sentiments are becoming far more consolidated across women through social media. So even if there isn't a traditional movement that excuse me, a traditional movement that is imbibing this ideology, and like they don't have like a 100-page manifesto that they follow. And even if it is practiced more in like a in the personal sphere, like it's choices that these women make, a lot of them still try to like this advocacy for antinatalism is still proliferated within their own social conditions by them making do with like gathering on Weibo or creating popular online forums where a lot of women are now consolidating their experiences, not just with motherhood but with like dating and with marriage. So the point of this really is just that this messaging can be very effective even if it doesn't take as much like using the same like resources of like messaging and the same goal of like providing solace. So the reason why it works is two things. The first is because a lot of this messaging capitalizes on existing dissatisfaction. So for example, with women in South Korea, the 4B ideology really started to boom because a lot of them were noticing in both public spaces and in like their private homes the way that like women are abused and oppressed, um the way that like the dating pool is just so terrible and unfair to women, the way that like the discrimination that they experience is compounded on by like skewed male female birth ratios. And so this this messaging was really effective in one capitalizing on that dissatisfaction, and also by opening the eyes of many women who were just coming across these online forums, just coming across these social media accounts, and then after noticing it in their own real lives. And so what that means is that this becomes one of the ways in which women are able to actually talk about the struggles that they experience, which they otherwise cannot. Like the reason why they turn to social media is because they can be anonymous there. It is really difficult to crack down on their sentiments. And yes, this has warranted like a lot of censorship on these platforms, but like even then like they're not losing their jobs and they're not putting themselves at risk on the street. And so the advocacy can like proliferate in that way. But the second is that the most baseline benefit from this advocacy really is just greater information sharing, which is still good even in the instances wherein women continue to stay mothers, um or like they continue to bear and rear children. So the reason as to why it's really hard to consolidate about the hardships of motherhood without an antinatalist campaign from feminists is because the current idea of it is that hardships in motherhood are often to be bore alone or to be taken on alone. Not being able to fulfill your motherly duties is often seen as a moral failure on your part, and a lot of struggles are often masked as you being a bad mother. Sorry. And this is in part because the larger narrative or the hegemonic narrative is that of the nuclear family, which doesn't so much as like champion information sharing in the community or like communally raising children. And therefore, that means to say that a lot of hardships that mothers face is often taken alone, and it like to complain about being a mother is seen as a moral failure, an individual failure, as opposed to a systemic problem that many other women also experience. And it's not just like complaining about how hard it is to have a job and to also do domestic tasks. It's also like it's the complaints about how difficult it is to raise a child in a way that is, less pretty. Like the fact that the children can be annoying and can hold you back. um it is talking about like your desires for a life other than what you have now in a way that isn't really resenting your children, and more just being about wanting to be selfish and put your ambitions first, or your career first, things like that. Like these are things that are very taboo, and therefore, when the movement launches an anti-natalist advocacy and highlights a lot of the systemic problems and systemic struggles that are made inherent to motherhood, that makes it a lot easier to talk about these topics because it is then not framed as a moral failing or an individual fault, but as um, a way in which like women are systemically oppressed. Yeah. So that's my first problem, and that's how I would respond to that. The second is, I think there's a bit of homogeneity and understanding how people internalize motherhood. And this is in part a problem of that op argument that I talked about, and also problem of that government might face. So government might run into the problem of painting motherhood as a universally terrible experience, whereas opposition will like implicitly push that like women who do and can find it empowering are individuals whose choices we need to validate most. And I don't necessarily agree with that, or I think it's something that can be contested on government. So I think a better government idea here is not to try to brute force prove your way into saying that like, no, motherhood is universally and for every woman bad, and any person who thinks that it is empowering is brainwashed. I don't think that's smart. Judges won't buy it. I think what can clarify this a bit better is positioning this messaging against existing narratives as a strategy. So what I mean by this is you want to counter the coercion point and the alienation point that might come out from op, and explain that there is comparative and entrenched coercion regarding motherhood. So it's three things. Number one is that a lot of narratives around motherhood being fulfilling are usually imposed onto women when they're very vulnerable. So it is instilled in us when we're children, for example, and can't question it. It starts from when we are super young and we are told that like it is going to be our greatest source of fulfillment and meaning someday. And oftentimes this is also proliferated by people that are super close to us and people that we trust and we love, like our parents or relatives. And so there's that added pressure that makes it really hard for us to question this narrative of motherhood as fulfilling. The second is that it is also a lack of information and a lack of alternatives that are made accessible to us. So this is where I'll go on a bit of like a tangent on this reading that I had. So there's this reading from my gender and sexuality class. It looked into um it looked into teenage pregnancy in the Philippines. And the researcher interviewed like five women, I believe, who were all teenage mothers in Tondo, Manila. And they were ranging from the ages of 12 to I think 17 was the oldest, or 16, something like that. And basically um the patterns that were derived from their responses were a couple of things. The first is that there is a lot of their sexuality and their knowledge of sex is heavily controlled by like male narratives or by men. So by virtue of the amount of knowledge that men have disproportionate to women, they are able to control the sexuality and the engagement of sex that a lot of girls have. And this is because of the five of them, majority um, learned about sex, like learned about pornography through their boyfriends who introduced it to them. And that was really harmful, or that led to a lot of their accounts of the first time that they had sex to be of them being unable to refuse their boyfriends who like like encourage them to do it, or it led to them not knowing how, like, that they can insist on using like a condom, for example. Like, one of the boyfriends of the girls um chose not to use a condom, and they couldn't say anything because they thought that they would be careful, because the boyfriend was like, yeah, I'll be careful and I'll pull out and whatever. So basically the first pattern is that so many girls and their idea of like motherhood and of sex, these are super male controlled. The second is that there's a complete lack of information even from like their community. And in their community, they're also like their mothers and their sisters were also teenage mothers, or also were pregnant impregnated in their teens. And even then they didn't really learn about like sex ed, or they weren't really told about like the hardships of motherhood and whatever. um and it was only after they already gave birth that like they were included in these discussions. um and that's because it was again deemed very taboo to talk about these things with girls who you see as like young and as pure, etc. Basically it's that there's a um hegemony of like the information that is given to everybody except women, and that makes it really hard for them to not just um opt out of motherhood because the narrative is that it's really good, but also to seek out other alternatives, or means in which they can actually opt out of motherhood, or prevent um, motherhood at that their age, or control how they engage in motherhood. So the third point is also that even if they do want to opt out, there's a lot of like guilt that is laced into narratives, especially when these girls resist. So, for example, when they resist, oftentimes their duty to their family, their moral duty as part of a religion, or their duty to save the nation's economic health, a lot of these things are often brought up. And that last bit is true. Like, so many um, especially in like in countries with declining birth rates, like the state becomes really honest about like why they want women to procreate and how they view women's bodies, by saying that like our it's important for our economy and our economic health. Meanwhile, a lot of these women are actually choosing to not give birth because they don't get that support, for example. Anyway, what this means is just that many women who do want to make the choice to opt out, and many women who do struggle with motherhood, are usually the least empowered to make that decision to opt out. And therefore, what that means to say is that the feminist movement has greater obligation towards these women, and greater obligation to empower these women who to make these choices and to have that option on the table at all, which is often crowded out by larger mainstream narratives that are pro-natalist. I'm at 5%, so I'm gonna make this a little bit quick. So the content portion, I want to talk about the feminist movement and motherhood, and its history with motherhood. The first thing I want to note is that it's really important to be cognizant on both sides, whether or not you're defending it, opposing it, whatever, to not generalize experiences with motherhood. And that's not just like generalizing it to be black and white, good or bad in this context versus that context, but it is also generalizing the specific nuances of like how women experience patriarchal oppression, especially when you're illustrating. And I'm gonna reference a study that I read in a class to illustrate this point. So there's this study by Perennias, like published in 2005. It looks at gender global hierarchies, specifically looking into domestic work and Filipino domestic workers. So at the top of the hierarchy are women in like Italy, for example, or like more developed countries who um, rejected domestic work after a period of dissatisfaction, seeing how the men in their lives refused to take part in the load and refused to take part in doing domestic work because they felt emasculated by it. It came after a period of them realizing that they carried the burden of a double shift where they're working, they're already integrated in the workforce, they're working their 9 to 5, and then they come home and they have to do all the work in the house as well. And so they rejected doing domestic work. However, in Italy, like the culture didn't change, right? Like it didn't change such that men were now doing the domestic work or now it was split 50-50. Instead, it created this vacuum in the sphere of reproductive work, which was then filled by women from the quote unquote third world, like the Philippines, who had their own specifically gendered motivations for fleeing. So, a lot of these women, aside from wanting to seek greener pastures, also experience quote unquote push factors um, to move to these other countries. For example, they'd be heavily mistreated and abused in their own home. They live in a country where apparently the threshold to prove that a woman committed adultery is so much lower than proving that a man committed adultery. And so, because of their systemic disadvantaged position, working abroad and going abroad was one of the only ways and strategies that they had to escape. Um, However, this meant that they were experiencing a different set of problems as opposed to the women in developed nations who were hiring them. One is that obviously their experience with the patriarchy is compounded on by the fact that they are immigrants and that they are treated as second class citizens in this country. It is also compounded on by the fact that because they are abroad, then it becomes really hard for them to navigate and continue their duties as mothers, right? Like it's really hard to um, be nurturing and be caring from all the way across the world. Um, and they're also dealing with the way that they are treated in the homes of these, um, in the homes that they work at instead. So that means that like the way that um third world like these OFW women experience gender discrimination is different from how women in Italy of a higher class experience it. And it's not just that. There's also a discussion about the women who are left behind. The women who don't have enough money or credentials um to go or like means to go abroad and work abroad. So these Filipino women now have to fill in the vacuum that OFW women left. And they now experience the same problem of having to leave their family in the province, work in Metro Manila, and they get significantly less pay for their domestic work here as opposed to the money that their the woman who hired them gets from abroad. This is really just to paint the picture of how um one is that we obviously experience gender discrimination in different ways, and it is complicated and changed by our other positions, like what country we are from, our social class, like our ethnicity and our citizenship. These are all things that change how we experience gender discrimination. And not one of them, like, I wouldn't claim that any one of them isn't a victim of gender discrimination. It's just that the ways that they experience it manifest differently. Um, and there are more factors and more identities that are compounding on some people versus others. So that's really just to illustrate this point. But if you did find that sort of like summary ish from me, you should go read the Perennials reading. It's or like you should read their work. Yeah. The second thing that I want to talk about with regards to the feminist movement and motherhood is the origins, or I guess the development rather, the development of um, feminist antinatalism. So it is largely said that feminist antinatal stances were developed during the second wave in Australia and in the US. So, a prominent author on the theory is Greer from Australia, who largely criticized the nuclear family, the control of female sexuality, and like narratives and national pressures on reproduction. So, again, the messaging was less about demonizing mothers. In fact, this was largely perpetuated during the same time that the movement was advocating for more choice with like access to things like abortion and contraceptives, and also more like pro women and children stances like advocating for free and accessible childcare services. So it is at this point where I want to acknowledge that these second wave developments were in like Australia and the US. But the thing is, I don't really like discounting these frameworks by using this shorthand that it's a concept of white privileged people because of like two things. The first is that I think too many people think that this means that these are invisible problems as opposed to genuinely entrenched, as opposed to it being a genuinely entrenched and systemic way in which many men turn women into step stools. But the second reason is because I think that using this shorthand immediately disrupts our ability to cross check it with our own conditions and experiences. So, like, yes, knowing this context is very important because it flags to us that a lot of these works were conceptualized by women who were at home and who, yes, didn't have their own like economic liberation, but that because they were white and because many of them were also quite rich, they were living in suburban homes and often off of the labor of women of color. And all of this is true, and I think we can acknowledge that. Yet I still think cross checking our own experiences and our own histories with the accounts of women from vastly different cultural and historical contexts from us is important. Because a lot of feminists in India, for example, and a lot of women in the Philippines are not so removed and not so and don't experience things that are so different from like the larger idea in these texts or in these books, right? Like maybe it's not 100% the same illustration of the problem, but we can definitely see and identify for ourselves flavors of it in our own real life, in our own lived experiences. And I think that cross checking is really important because that makes us posit the really important question as to why, even in distinguished contexts, are women experiencing and feeling and thinking similar things. And I think that also makes us look at our history a bit more because we then say similar things, but the difference is that our lens is through, like, we look at it in a colonial context about how women's position, like the Devadasi in India or like the Babaylans in the Philippines, how these were, people, women who were essentially empowered in the community and then became, yeah, and then our roles transformed and our position in society transformed. So I think looking at that and looking at how at what point in history our experiences converge and become similar um, is really important in developing diverse narratives as well. And I think that's something that we don't get when we immediately dismiss ideas, frameworks, concepts, and stories by people who are just of a different context than ours. So I wanted to discuss the origins of anti-natalist stances, and not origins, but more like where was it developed. Um, to point that out, but to also explain how, like, to sort of like illustrate how these ideas were constructed. Though I do want to also say that there is a valid point coming from like the the choice feminist argument that I pointed out, which is that it is true that there are women who genuinely derive empowerment from things like motherhood. And no, it is not in like this choice feminism way where like everything goes. Um, but for example, many black women during the same period in the US when like Betty Friedan was writing about the trap of like motherhood and marriage. In that same period, a lot of women of color didn't really resonate with it, largely because the home was really important for them to feel empowered. And again, it's not in the digital modern choice feminism way. It's really because they were largely cast aside by the rest of society, and they often experienced abuse and exploitation in the workplace. And so that means that the home became a really important, site of refuge, of healing. And often they believed or they raised their children in radical love and believed that raising children well is not just fulfilling a duty that women have, but it is also one of the ways that they are able to um survive, one of the ways that like they can assert an existence that the outside world was trying to erase. And I think that is so much more of an interesting and so much more of a complex understanding and illustration of what it means to be empowered by motherhood, because it is rooted in like an understanding of their material realities and how this thing or how this role can genuinely empower them. This is true in Africa as well, for example, where many communities don't follow like traditional nuclear family models. Instead, many women don't really view motherhood as a trap that needs to be rejected or escaped. Rather, it is understood in the context of community empowerment, where in the community, women are actually, or mothers are actually revered and respected. Um, because again, it also becomes a matter of um, community survival, and it also becomes about um, radical love and nourishment, which are life-giving things, as opposed to the illustration of you know these Western second wave feminists of it being very lonely, of it being very listless, of it even like the setting itself is like in a suburban home that like they just don't relate to. Yeah, so my phone ended up dying, so I'm so sorry for the lack of visual and maybe audio continuity. But anyway, so yeah, basically this is just um I think a more um substantial illustration or reason as to why there are women who validly feel empowered by motherhood, and it also explains why you can't just prioritize the women who find mother like it makes the claim that like we need to like women who choose to reject motherhood are far more vulnerable. It makes that claim a little bit harder to run because a lot of these women actually are already ostracized in society or have been ostracized in society, and therefore motherhood actually becomes reframed as this like a comparative strategy is to reframe our experiences with motherhood and to adopt things like communal um, like burden sharing and communal raising of children, perhaps, which can't happen if the movement is largely antinatalist or if the view is largely hostile towards um, raising children and often views like maybe you're not demonizing mothers, but it becomes extremely hard to create networks with them. Like you just prove the alienate, you go hard on the alienation point, I suppose. um and it also like when you approach these group of people believing that they aren't agentic, And with this existing narrative of them already as victims, the kind of quality of help that you're going to extend to them, and these networks that you create are going to be very poorly constructed in a way that doesn't actually empower them, in a way that isn't actually grounded in the community experience. So that's one way that I think I would run the opposition argument as opposed to running the choice feminism case. Um, so yeah, that concludes the larger lecture proper. Um, Obviously, again, this is pretty condensed, and there are more motions on feminism that I think you're probably going to encounter and that are also quite interesting. So there's a huge chunk of feminism motion specifically about sex work. um, there's also a really interesting one about like the commercialization of childbirth services, or like things like surrogacy. um, like there's this thing called ART, or art, I believe, and it's basically the creation of like technology, and then you put it in a in another woman's uterus, etc. Basically, that's really interesting as well to look into because it crosses into issues of both motherhood, and our notions, or like our narratives of motherhood. Like there's this idea of biological and social motherhood, and what that does is that it reduces motherhood into like the biological conception of it only. But it also like is kind of similar to issues about prostitution because it's about like the use of women's bodies as like a means to an end, as like incubators. And there is also like there's a nuance to that issue specifically about white women in the developed world, again using and contracting the bodies of developing women and essentially dumping the labor of like physically nurturing a child onto these women, carrying them to term. And it becomes a question again of a lot of these women who become surrogates or who carry these children are put in circumstances and in positions where the right to consent, their ability to consent and to properly choose is made very difficult and is made very questionable about like by their economic conditions, yes, but also by like very specific gender conditions. So that's another really interesting topic to look into, um, or to research about that I unfortunately couldn't cover in this lecture. That said, here is like a mini syllabus ish things that I think are interesting or that you might want to read. Um, if you want to, because I couldn't cover them. Like maybe you'd be interested in looking further into these things. So I am seeing a bit of motions. I don't know if I've seen one recently about carceral feminism. So it like you can look into where and how it is implemented. And this is really a question of like gender justice. What is like to what extent can we collaborate with like state apparatus to carry out gender justice? I think there are really interesting criticisms on this as well, specifically from abolitionist perspectives, Angela Davis in particular. Um, the another thing I'm seeing more is this motions on like the separatist movement. So it's interesting to look at the historical roots of it, specifically in political lesbianism. That was also, I believe, a second wave phenomenon. And right now, I think the way that it's manifesting is not really political lesbianism, but like with the 4B, for example, it's more about heteropessimism. Um, like it's similar in that they're both abstaining from relationships with men, but very different nuances, I suppose. Like heteropessimism is more talks more about like a disillusionment with it. And there are many questions talking about how we reconcile these bad experiences and struggles with men and also our desire for things like human connection. Yeah. So 4B is definitely interesting, gaining a lot of attention, but I actually don't have a lot of like formalized resources on it. So instead, I think if you don't find a lot of resources on it, a better like short handle is heteropessimism. The third is on masculinities. Um, and who you'd want to read there is Raywin Connell. Um, if you're looking for like academic journals, she coined the term hegemonic masculinity, which is a really interesting framework to understand um, how men negotiate their positions in the patriarchy. And also, it's not just about men, but it's also about narratives of masculinity and so comparatively narratives of femininity. Um, and the reason and Connell is actually like cited in every journal that you will probably read about masculinities, because this is also a rising topic in gender studies. I did like a mini paper on it last session for my major. Very interesting stuff. Um, and I think it's worth engaging with because I'm seeing a lot of motions specifically about like what feminists should do with men, what are men's position in the feminist movement, and like um, it's also interesting because of like the manosphere right now, and also questions, and like the male loneliness epidemic. So yeah, more readings on that was really interesting. Um, the fourth is on queer feminism, obviously. Most immediate source in that, and who has personally deepened my understanding of this, is Butler on gender performance. Though I'm sure there are more. The fifth one is on sex work. So I definitely would recommend Andrea Dworkin's work um, on intercourse and pornography. Though, caveat, she uses very crass and explicit language. Like a lot of her work has very like there's a lot of shock value in it. But beyond the shock value, it's actually really incisive. But yeah, I say this caveat because like if you aren't of the appropriate age to read um work about like sex and pornography, um, or maybe even if like you're not comfortable with that, probably don't read her work yet. But to balance her perspective a bit, because she is famously very, very critical of the sex work industry. Um, I do recommend to balance her out reading this study. It's called Illicit Flirtations. It's by Perennias. The one same person I mentioned earlier. Um, it's basically a study of Filipino women who are entertainers in Japan, and it takes a more like I think the way that it frames these girls is they're a lot more agentic, and I think part of talking about sex work means also giving more privilege to the voices of sex workers and like their own testimonies. So it's like Andrea Dworkin talks a lot about like conceptual things, like principle things. But I think the reason why illicit flirtation, I think balances her perspective a bit is that it humanizes, you know, this topic that like, we all, I think the way that a lot of people discuss sex work and sex worker in itself takes away a lot of like their agency or frames them as like people who are so removed from us and our everyday experiences and the things that we go through, like they're so removed from like the sexual politic that we women who aren't sex workers experience. And so I think reading their testimonies brings them back into larger discussions about the sexual politics that we ourselves are involved in and we ourselves have a stake in. Um, anyway, yeah, I really recommend reading this study. I also recommend Michael L. Tan's work. It's called Walking the Tightrope, Sexual Risk and Male Sex Work in the Philippines. Shout out again to my gender and sexuality class last time. This reading was really interesting. I really liked the discussion on it. And I think it kind of widens your view of sex work a bit because like the default is to think of sex work and relate it to women and like OF girls. But actually, like there are a lot of men who also engage in sex work and who also go through similar problems. For more of a fiction perspective or like storytelling vibes, I recommend Chimamanda and Ngozi Adichie. as well as Annie Ernaux. Um, for Adichie, I read That Thing Around Your Neck, and for Erno, I really recommend A Girl's Story. So those are these aren't academic journals, and the narrative is really good, and they're amazing writers. So if you're more interested in that, I recommend these two authors. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you so much for watching this lecture. I hope you're here to the end. And if you did find any of these interesting, I hope you do end up reading some of these stuff or looking into these works. Yeah, thanks everyone, and good luck and fast forward.